Well, we are coming to the end of in fact, we are at the end, last day, of our Lessons from the Desert series. And we're going to try and wrap it all up today with a pair of binoculars. That's how we're going to wrap it up. But before we do that, I want to tell you about a conversation that Yvonne and I had not that long ago, just before we moved to Delaware. Let me know if this conversation sounds familiar to you. Yvonne says, the dishwasher is not running well. It's leaving a lot of residue. Perhaps should we get it looked at? And I said, why? It's only a couple years old. It shouldn't be causing us any problem. And she goes, no, I think it's more than a couple years old. I think it's more like 5 years old. I'm like, no way. I still remember putting it in. And she goes, now that I think about it, I think it'd be more like 10 years old. I'm like, no way that thing is 10 years old. It's like, no, I remember because we changed the color in the kitchen when we put that in. And I'm like, you're right. It's 10 years old. When did that happen? Anybody ever done that? With their appliances or their furniture or their car, right? Time just seems to go by and you're like, I don't know what happened. It goes by faster than we ever imagined. When we get through this next week and a half, we're going to get through Christmas with the Christmas morning and family gatherings, which could be stressful, could be relaxing, maybe both for you. Time off from work, too much food. Our attention will begin to turn to the new year. And occasionally when we do that, we look back and we reflect on what's happened and on the history and on the past. And when I do this, sometimes I get frustrated because some things change, but other things never seem to. You ever have that? Especially when it comes to your spiritual life and your faith. It's like, oh my goodness, the struggles are the same. They haven't changed. The problems haven't changed. I've taken 2 steps forward and 3 steps back and 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. And it kind of gets frustrating. It's like that, I can't believe 10 years has gone by. What's different? When we're in the desert, that kind of feeling is compounded. It's magnified because we feel frustrated. We feel distant. We feel like we've been in this desert and nothing is changing. And so it's easy to wonder, what's the point of all this? Well, we've said the whole point of the desert is that it's fertile ground for transformation. So this entire series, we said, look, when you go through those desert times in your life between what was and where you want it to be, you're in this desert space, which can last for years or just days. But when we're in that space, there's actually fertile ground for transformation, where you're going to transform towards what God wants or away from it. And so we spent the last 6 weeks, we've used the Israelites as our model. And if we were to sum up the Israelites in our last 6 weeks, we would say something like this. They wandered through a difficult time and place, but God provided for them. He put them in challenging circumstances to encourage them to follow Him. He wanted them to become people who followed Him. Instead, they were a complaining people who didn't learn from their mistakes. They weren't like Moses, who put trust in God with his problems. And as a result, they never reached the promised land. They ended up spending 40 years wandering the desert until they died. And the thing they wanted more than anything else never happened. It seems to be a story of failure. And as I thought through the whole series of stories, I think there's one preeminent failure, right? There's all the specific events and the things that happen, but there's one failure in their trip through the desert, and it's the same failure that we run into in the desert, or the same failure that we are always in danger of in the failure, and it's simply the failure to trust. Because if we want to grow, and that's what the desert is for, there's a principle that says we are transformed when we choose to trust in God. Choose it. Because trust is necessary. If we're going to grow, trust is really, really important. In fact, it's something you have to have, because He's interested in our spiritual growth. He wants us to grow to be like Him. I mean, why do you think this was so critical for the Israelites? Why trust was such a big thing? Listen to this. This is what, while they're in the desert, these are things God is telling them. He says, look, for you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the people on the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. Later he says, you are a people holy to the Lord your God. Out of all the peoples on the face of the earth, the Lord has chosen you to be his treasured possession. He tells them that over and over and over. Have you ever thought, why? Right? We know God chose Abraham. There's nothing he did, but why did God have a chosen people? Like, why did that even matter? He didn't have to have a chosen people in the world. He could have just had people. What made him have a chosen people? He actually tells them. He does this over and over. He says, look, you're going to go into the promised land as my chosen people. And you will not be able to fulfill your destiny as my chosen people unless you trust in me. Because once they went into the promised land, think about this, they were supposed to be different from everybody else. They were supposed to live as what we say God reflectors, right? They were supposed to reflect God to the entire world. That was the purpose of them being a chosen people. I mean, God's laws, his commandments was going to set them apart. The idea was that other nations, other people would be drawn to the Creator through them. I mean, think about it. It would kind of go like this, right? Traders from caravans from Babylon to Egypt, they would go home and they would tell stories about Israel, and they would say, when you go through there, you don't even have to lock your doors. I mean, theft is virtually unheard of. I mean, we could sleep without fear of being attacked or plundered on the road. I mean, it was crazy. And when we talk to them, there's this level of respect and honor for people that we don't see anywhere else. I mean, they honor their parents, their neighbors. They keep their promises. I mean, they treat their slaves better than we treat each other. The hilltops are not dotted with altars. I mean, the blessing of God is obvious on this nation. Maybe there's something to that. That is what God had designed. When they were going through the desert, God's like, this is the goal. This is where I'm trying to get you guys. And so the desert was their training ground, from a people of slavery to a people who trust. Will you trust me when the water is limited? Will you trust me when food is in short supply? Will you trust me when you get tired of things? Because they weren't going to grow unless they learned to trust. You don't grow. And you all know this, by the way. Because if I asked you what are the greatest growth periods of your life, you never say, well, it was that year where nothing bad happened. Nobody says that. They say, no, yeah, I remember that year. That was the year from hell, literally or figuratively, but man, did I learn stuff, right? I mean, we know that. That's what happens. But that's a choice. That doesn't happen automatically. So here's the key. We don't need all the details to thrive in the desert. We've talked about the difference between lamenting and complaining and the need to know that God is a God who sees us, that he's all along there, which all leads us to this conclusion that if we're going to trust God, we don't need to know all the details. Because what's interesting about the Israelites, even though they knew the ultimate destination, right? They knew that the promised land was the goal. They didn't know what was going to happen next. God could have laid it out. He could have said, look, okay, here's the map. I gave it when I was giving it to Moses on the mountain. I gave him the law. I also gave him the map, right? Here's what the world looks like. I'm going to take you on this route. Here's how you're going to get there. Here's how long it's going to take. He didn't do any of that. What did he do? He said, I'm going to go in front of you in a cloud and a pillar of fire. Just follow me. Why? Because he delights in our confusion? No. It's because he wants people to trust him, to stay close enough to be transformed. See, radical, sweeping, transformational change tends to happen under pressure. You ever heard how they used to make samurai swords way back in the day? Like back in the hundreds and hundreds of years ago, they were a treasured possession. They were worth a fortune. Because when they made a samurai sword, what they do is they would heat and I don't even know what this means to fold metal, but they would fold metal, and so they would heat it, fold it, let it cool, heat it, fold it, heat it, fold it. So there was this. They were basically stressing the metal out over and over and over and over again. So by the time it was done, you couldn't damage it. And it would cut through other metals. It would cut through steel. They were you could only have that kind of sword through repeated ongoing stress. The original group of Israelites did not do that. They didn't trust God, they were not transformed, and they wandered for 40 years in the desert. But their children learned a little better. And maybe it's because the parents said, look, you do not want to make the mistake we made, so we are going to teach you. We're going to make sure that you understand this. We don't want you to go through what we went through. And maybe they just heard the stories of what had happened in the past, but the children seemed to grow up depending on God for everything. Whatever it was, this next generation, right, 38 years after they blew it at the border, and they'd wandered in circles, they finally came to the new land, new generation that trusted God. And we read kind of what happens here. It says, on the evening of the 14th day of the month, this is the end of their journeys, while camped at Gilgal on the plains of Jericho, they're ready to go into the promised land, the Israelites celebrated the Passover. And get this, the day after that Passover, the very day they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened bread and roasted grain. In other words, we've made it here. And the manna stopped the day after. They ate this food from the land. There was no longer any manna for the Israelites, but that year they ate the produce of Canaan. In other words, God said, look, you don't need that expression anymore because I got you. You're here. And it wasn't that they didn't need to trust anymore. It's just that the trust shifted. Okay, God, we don't have to trust you for food now, but now we have to fight battles and have military challenges and occupy and work the land. So we got to trust you still. That's still there. But this generation had developed this pattern of trust that allowed them to lean into that. I mean, if we're honest, the desert, it's not always, but often it's just a detour in our lives. It's not our whole life. It feels like it when we're in the middle of it. The detour of bankruptcy, the detour of cancer, the detour of a relationship gone wrong, the detail of a divorce, the detour of a runaway child. And even in the midst of all those detours, He's providing, He's blessing, and He's saying, trust me because there's breakthrough coming. Now, how we do that, how we come out of the desert with having grown and not bitter and angry, which is what you see a lot of times, is this way. It happens through incremental growth. Incremental. Incremental growth is simple, steady movement in the same direction. That's all it is. And it's continual. It's this idea of I'm going to align my heart with God on an ongoing basis so that when crisis comes, I'm more likely to respond redemptively. Because, I've seen this over and over. So have you. You know what this is like. When you see someone, they go to church, they look like they love God, and they're serving Him, and they're persevering, and then all of a sudden, something happens, and their life is rocked. And you've watched one of two things happen. You've watched these same people continue to be grateful. They're still joyful. They're persevering. They actually are leaning into things. You're like, I would be so angry right now. I don't know how you are doing this. How are you not just flipping out? How are you having this kind of grace you are with people? Like, how are you doing this? And then you see the other kind. And everything looked good until the crisis hit. And then they literally go off the cliff. And they vanish. And they start acting in ways you're like, what is going on with you? What's the difference? It's everything that happened in the years before. It's the little lessons. It's the personal habits of prayer, of reading a Bible, of learning to forgive, of learning to repent. You know, forgiving and repenting become really easy if you do it when the little things happen, and then when the really big things happen, you're like, okay, yeah, I've done this before, right? If you never forgive and you never repent, right? If you've never repented to your spouse, ever, and then something big happens, it's really hard. But if you roll over every morning and look at your wife and say, I'm sorry, then it's easy. Did none of you get that? No one should roll over every morning and say, I'm sorry. You haven't done anything wrong yet. Trying to bring a little humor here. But all these things, being with other Christians, being with non-Christians, being honestly vulnerable with people, being a good steward, accepting correction from others, practicing fasting, loving others, worshiping. All those things that when life is going well, we're like, oh my goodness, I don't have time for these things. That's what's going to determine how you react when the next desert comes. You've ever seen Rocky, right? Or a sports movie like Rocky? right? It typically has, in any movie like that, they have the training montage. Remember the training montage, right? That's where all of a sudden they have this really inspirational song, and then you watch Rocky, doing one-handed push-ups and speed boxing in the meat locker, hitting slabs of beef. And we see his power and his speed increasing. It culminates when he runs up the steps of the museum, the old Rocky pose. He's all excited. It's showing that through this whole time he's being stretched, he's being pushed, he's being prepared and stretched and pounded for what's to come. And that ongoing discipline is necessary for the story. There is nothing interesting about a story that goes like this. Naturally gifted athlete does nothing particularly demanding in preparation, but easily wins the title. Nobody wants to watch that. We get excited when there's this discipline, yet we shy from it in our own life. Saying yes to God again and again when there's very little at stake prepares you to say yes to God when there's a lot at stake, which is the desert. And so here's the end. The whole series. It all comes down to this. You will choose the impact the desert has on you. It is never accidental when you see someone respond to God in faith. It just isn't. It's a choice. When someone faces troubles and they're not destroyed, when you see someone who has that deep relationship with God in the face of incredible odds and incredible problems, and in sickness and with problems, when they've been deeply wronged by other people, when people have taken advantage of them, that is not accidental. That is a choice. It's interesting because when Moses was at the end of his life, at the end of the desert, he doesn't get to go in the promised land because of things that happen. Here's what he says to the entire group. He says, look, now what I'm commanding you today is not too difficult for you. It's not beyond your reach. In other words, he's like, you don't have to be super person, super spiritual for this. This is in your reach for everybody. He says it's not up in heaven, so you have to ask, who will ascend to heaven, get it, and proclaim it to us so obey it? In other words, he's saying, look, this isn't reliant on other people. You don't need leaders and pastors to do this for you. This is for you. Nor is it beyond the sea that you have to ask, who will cross the sea to get it and proclaim it to us so that we may obey it? No, the word is very near to you. It is in your mouth and in your heart so you may obey it. See, I'm setting before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. A choice. For I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, to keep his commands, decrees, and laws, and then you will live and increase. And the Lord your God will bless you in the land you are crossing the Jordan to possess. But if your heart turns away and you're not obedient, if you're drawn away to bow down to other gods and worship them, and whenever you see that in the Old Testament, right, they were talking about idols and gods. For us, it's anything that distracts us away and becomes more important than Jesus. Then I declare to you that you will certainly be destroyed. You will not live long in the land you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. This whole generation, by and large, with very few hiccups, actually followed this. They chose correctly. I mean, Moses laid out, he said, look, you guys, you have a choice. They took over the promised land. It took faith. It took trust. They grew as a nation. And then many, many years later, Joshua, who took over from Moses, now he's old. And he says to them basically the same thing. Now fear the Lord. Serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods of your ancestors. Worship beyond the Euphrates and in Egypt. Serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourself this day whom you will serve. Whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites in who you are living. And you all know this one. But as for me, my household, we're going to serve the Lord. In other words, don't be in this part way. If you decide that it's your job and your family and all that is going to take precedence over everything else, if you're just going to do your life and fit God in the sides, then be honest about it. But for me, I'm all in. Because it's going to change my life. And it'll change your life. And the story, unfortunately, does not end well. Because we read this. This is not that long removed from their desert experience, maybe a generation or two. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him, who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. I don't know why that's in there. After that, whole generation had been gathered to the ancestors. Another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. And the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. In other words, life was okay, the desert was done, and they got on with life, and God got left behind. And the entire book of Judges, if you read it, is repeated accounts of God taking Israel through desert experience after desert experience after desert experience, trying to get them to come back to trust in him. And they didn't. And we read, in those days Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. I think the desert is a lot like looking through binoculars. Because when we're in the desert, our vision gets a little bit compromised, doesn't it? If you ever look through a pair of binoculars, right, it zeroes in on one thing. Khalil is really close to me right now, right? But what it does, it zeroes in on something. And when we're in the desert, it occupies our attention, and our focus is all on that, and it's all about what others have done to us. It's what is happening to us, the sickness that we're going through, and we get frustrated because that thing that we're looking at, if it doesn't get fixed, I can't handle it. I got to turn off from it. I'm going to run away from it, and that's what happens. And then occasionally, when we start acting like children, it's like turning the binoculars around. You ever watched your kids do this? Right? My grandkids love the binoculars, and they always look through it this way. Well, Khalil looks like he's in Maryland right now. Right? Like, that's a long ways away. You know how when you look through the other way through binoculars, right? And what happens is when we're going through the desert and we kind of start to have a wrong perspective, guess what happens to God? He goes further and further and further away. Our perspective is off because we've forgotten about this. Someone gave me a principle once with binoculars that served me very well for my whole life. Because if you ever put these up like this and then try to find something, you never can find it, right? Because you're like, where is that thing I was looking for? Because you're staying in this zone and you're trying to find it. This is what happens when we go through the desert. We're like, oh my goodness, things are trouble. I need God. God, where are you, God? Someone said to me once, look at the thing you want to see and then put the binoculars right there and you'll see him up close. When we're going through life, we keep our eyes focused on Jesus. And when we get in the desert, he says, just keep here, keep here. I know that the world is narrowing around you. There's nothing else that you can think of but this. But if you keep your eyes focused on me, I actually get closer and not further away. My friends, every one of you has been, is currently, or will be going through a desert of some type. For a lot of us, it's relational deserts with people who have abandoned us, hurt us. Some of it's historical, some of it's current. For some of us, it's physical. It's the ongoing battle with pains and aches that just never seem to go away. For some of it's financial and this unrelenting pressure because we just never seem to have enough. It could be anything. But my friends, the desert is not meant for anything other than to invite you to a greater trust of Jesus. And if you do, the promised land is waiting. Whatever that looks like for you. And even if we never get the full effect of what we desire, we get a whole bunch of little promised lands along the way.